can't tell if it's recording yet or not. I think it is. All right, welcome back to the Chris Buskirk Show. I am going to dispose with our usual intro. I don't think it's necessary. A lot of the folks who listen to the show will already be familiar with my guest today. It's Sohrab Ahmari, opinion page editor of the New York Post. I think I've got your title right there, Sohrab. If not, feel free to chastise me viciously. And also the author of a great new book that I read like half of it, and then I put it down because I got involved in something else, and then I finished the rest of it over the weekend. It's called The Unbroken Thread, and I enjoyed the book for a lot of different reasons. But I can't remember if you were part of this conversation or not, Sohrab, but the question about writing in books or not, you had sent me a PDF of the book, and I have in my Kindle, I've got all kinds of notes on it, so that's a good thing. It means I was thinking about it. But I guess the thing to start off with is, well, you know what? Actually, let me back up. I'm going to ask a predicate question to what I was going to say. So I think this kind of helps me get to the why of the book, which is where I'm going to go. Is like, why this book and why now? But you have been pretty public about your fairly recent conversion to Catholicism, and maybe talk about like how that happened, and then like I have a sense that maybe that's part of the why for this book, but maybe answer those two questions as a way to start off.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, Chris. It was nice to meet you recently, finally, after years of just being online friends. Thanks for having me. So the why I became a Catholic question is a weighty and kind of extensive one, and
you have 280 characters to explain it all.
Exactly. So I wrote a memoir about my conversion. It was my previous book titled "From Fire by Water."
Mm-hmm.
So very briefly, I was born and raised in Iran into a kind of secular liberal family, which is typical of the Iranian middle class. My parents had supported the Iranian Revolution and almost instantaneously come to regret it. And so I lived in this world where behind closed doors, we had alcohol in our house against the rules of the Islamic Republic, and lots of Western books, movies, and ideas were frequently discussed in my parents' milieu. And then in my outside our house's doors, in the outside world, obviously was the new Islamic Republic that had come to power after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, and is a real theocracy, and all the sort of brutality and hypocrisies actually of living under the Islamic Republic compelled me to become an atheist at age 13. And like most teenagers, I thought I was the first one to hit upon the idea that there might be no God, and how transgressive that was, and how deliciously transgressive. And then, we immigrate to the United States. I had always looked to the West as my true home, even before I ever set foot in the United States. And my idea of the West was a kind of decadent Manhattan. It's like a picture you would get from about the United States from watching 1980s American cinema, and that's what I thought I was getting into. As it happened, I'm on this KLM flight, and you notice the flight skip right over Manhattan as you watch the map of the flight path. Skip right over Manhattan and land in a place called Minneapolis, St. Paul. Okay, we don't stop there either. We then fly a bit more to Salt Lake City, Utah. And my uncle, the one who has sponsored us for the green card, picks me up and takes us to a town called Eden, Utah, population 600, surrounded by Mormons. And that made me an even more of a kind of militant atheist. In other words, I had taken an oppositional stance with respect to the Islamic regime in Iran, and I almost instantly kind of shifted those oppositional energies to this new society that I found. And it's whatever thin Judeo-Christian remnants you can imagine was there, I thought was a great source of backwardness, that it was holding back America from being fully itself with this kind of individualistic modern society. Then 20 years later, I'm received into the Catholic Church, and the in between is a very long story of my living the liberated life that I had imagined and being very dissatisfied, feeling like there was something missing, some profound things missing from it. You know, I tried out different ideologies, as it were, and they ultimately didn't answer my yearning for ultimate meaning. And as I get older, I begin to read, I actually get to read the Bible instead of just assuming, you know, as a college student, I just assumed that the Bible had been debunked, you know, or Plato had been debunked by things that came more recently. So and whatever was newest was also must have been best. That was my kind of operating assumption. But that I actually got to sort of seriously engage with it, and through a long process of reading and reflection, I came to believe that there is an objective moral order, and my own conscience seemed to reflect that objective moral order. And if there were an objective moral order, at some point I had to decide what is the source of it. So that led me to believe in a personal God. And then along the way, there were some providential encounters with the Catholic Mass. And those combination of things, the reading and those strange encounters with the sacrifice of the Mass, led me to eventually become a Catholic. When I did convert, I was living in London. I was working for the Wall Street Journal opinion page. To bring it to the current book, I'm sort of speeding things up. To bring it to the current book, basically. So in that sense, you know, the life outline that I shared with you just now just suggests that I'm sort of the paradigmatic liberal subject, right? I'm an immigrant. I'm plucked out of Utah to New York City to work in journalism by our meritocracy. I'm then shipped to London, and all the sort of exhilarating dynamism that involves. But then when I become a person of faith and I get married, I have, you know, my wife and I have our first child, and suddenly all that dynamism seems not only not to be enough, but in some ways to threaten what a father cares about, which is posterity. What am I leaving to my children? Right. And so the current book is my attempt to try to grapple with the kind of man that our current civilization would chisel out of my son, Max. He's now 4 years old. He was 2 when I started writing the book. And I have a great deal of concern about the account of freedom that he'll inherit, the account of freedom that our elites inherit that prevails in the West, basically, is that freedom means to just have the maximum amount of choice, to keep your options open in life, in common parlance, and to be unrestrained by tradition, by authority. And that, I think, is an impoverished account of freedom. And in my own life, I've seen its poverty, and I think there's a much more cogent, much more fulfilling account of freedom to be found, broadly speaking, in the classical and Christian tradition, which says actually freedom is to be able to govern yourself, not only to be free from external tyrants, but to be free from the tyranny of yourself, of your base appetites. And that brand of freedom actually welcomes limits, welcomes restraints, and suggests that the loss of those limits and restraints is I see the dog that you mentioned, by the way. That the loss
there he is.
that the loss of those limits makes us less free. So this is the idea in the book, is that I'm worried that my son will, in keeping his options open all his life, not actually exercise his freedom, not be fully human. And so I want to pass something on to him of this deeper account that is encapsulated under the rubric of tradition. And in doing that, I want to give him something more than myself. I'm just a journalist. I'm just a storyteller. So instead of my own kind of banging the drum and telling my son, this is how you should live, I pose 12 questions in the book, each of which poke holes in one of our kind of contemporary liberal, technocratic, secular certainties. And I explore each of those through the life of one great thinker. Some of them kind of predictable, like St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas, but some less so, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and the Sabbath, or even the feminist Andrea Dworkin on questions of sexuality. And so the book is I don't know, it's a sort of genre that I created of posing a set of open-ended questions or big questions, and then answering them through the art of biography. And so yeah, that's the.
Were you surprised? I mean, the way I hear you telling this is the birth of your son that sort of took and brought an even keener edge to your faith and to your thinking about what the implications of that are for life. I guess A, is that fair? And B, if it was, because I know it's certainly been the case for me, and having kids does make one focus on eternal things with a much in a much more serious way, even if one was fairly serious about it before. But were you surprised by the effect that being a father had on you?
Absolutely. I mean, there was concerns that I never had before. I mean, I'll be honest. One of the things that prompted me to write this book was I was riding in the New York subway with my son. He was 1 at the time. This was in 2018, and that's the year that OkCupid launched these ads, these subway ads that said DTF down to F word, and basically encouraging random hookups. And I just wondered, okay, what if my son were a little older and he were to ask me, what does DTF mean? This is something as a sort of singleton living in New York City, I never thought about. I mean, I never was whatever you see the ads, you forget about it. But you suddenly become aware, okay, how is my son being formed by these things? Because I know that people get formed by the messages that a society sends them, not just what.
Of course, yeah.
So there's a sort of anxiety, but to reduce it all to the anxiety is not quite fair. There's also this joy of posterity, right? Like I am not just living for myself, but I'm living in a line of duty, the duty of the father or the mother, and that comes with, yes, responsibility, but also comes with just tremendous joy. And that mixture of joy and anxiety, I think, is familiar to parents, but it just was unimaginable to me when I was childless. So absolutely, that's a big factor.
It's interesting. In Romans, the book of Romans, Paul uses the analogy of God as being a potter and we're the clay. Like it's an illustration of the creator-creature distinction, and that plays out obviously in a lower way, and but it's nonetheless analogous in the way that a human father, human mother, parents form their children.
And the doctrine of analogy got very useful in reading that passage.
Yeah, there's a passage, I've got it here. I'm gonna just read a couple sentences of something you wrote. It's one of the number of things that I kind of that I wrote around. It says, this is pretty early in the book. It says, our version of freedom sprang from the European Enlightenment, a philosophical movement that, quote, sought to liberate man from the dead hand of tradition, close quote, as one historian of ideas has written. Beginning in the late 18th century, men and women inspired by Enlightenment ideas swept violently through the West, assailing every source and symbol of authority that stood in the way of the sovereign individual and his autonomous exercise of his reason and his rights. And then you go on to talk about you mentioned what happened in France, and then skipping down a little bit, it says, for the Enlightenment thinkers, what people did with their freedom mattered far less than their being generally unrestrained, to marry or divorce, to worship or blaspheme, to serve others, or hoard wealth. I mean, that summed up a lot. I mean, I thought that was a key point you were making, because one of my accounts of the tension in politics and culture in the West right now is that on the left, using kind of the normal categories, on the left, people talk about justice, right? That's sort of their overarching norming goal.
Mm-hmm.
And just being able to be an autonomous individual, that's justice. And if you restrain somebody from that, that's unjust. The right has its own version of that, which is really just a mirror. But we talk about liberty or we talk about freedom, but it almost in very disturbingly similar terms. And it creates a neutered right, which is incapable of understanding the purpose of freedom or what it means. And I guess you've been a pretty outspoken critic of a lot of Enlightenment philosophy. I mean, I guess let's cut right to the heart. Was that always embedded in Enlightenment philosophy, or was it a derangement of it?
No, to cut to the right of it, the heart of it, I think the major strands of Enlightenment philosophy reject the idea of a telos, of an end that is intrinsic to everything in nature. Everything in nature acts for an end, and that end is discernible to human reason. That's the kind of classical Christian view. So for human beings, as a rational animal, their true end is to know and to love God, because he's the source of reason. He's the source of all order in the world. And the fact that our senses and what we observe in the world, the orderly causation that we see in the world, seem to suggest that there's this ultimate being who must have caused everything else, points to the fact that God is a reasonable God, and as a reasonable creature, you would seek union with reason itself, with the logos itself. That's the kind of teleological account of the human person that Christianity offers, and but there's also sort of as an animal, he also has kind of, as a rational animal, he also has natural ends, that he finds happiness in. He's a political animal, so he wants to be in society. He's capable of love, so he wants to be in family and in widening circles of love with political communities. All of this Enlightenment philosophy rejects, because it just rejects, I would argue, it narrows what can be known by reason to what can be observed with the senses, and the orderly causation that man observes, Enlightenment philosophy says, is just a kind of it's an illusion. Just because everything always happens a certain way, when you throw a brick at a glass window, it breaks every time. That's just, it's only sort of the repetition that makes you think that there is a reason why that should happen every time. I'm sorry. This is
the David Hume account, right? Yeah. About hitting the billiards balls.
Exactly. So,
yeah.
Suddenly man becomes alien to his own nature. Things that pre-moderns were able to reason about, and the pre-moderns were able to reason about a lot, all the way up to the creator of the world, without the aid of revelation. Aristotle suggested that there must be an uncaused cause in the world. All of that becomes it gets thrown away, and it gets expunged from the realm of reason, and so reason becomes this narrow. It gets reduced to what can be observed with the senses, and what can be done by man in history. So truth is no longer, being itself isn't truth per se. Truth is what you can make and what you've done in history. Verum quia faciendum, as Vico says. Truth is what you've made in history. And so that, on one sense, it brings great liberation with it, because you're no longer bound by a telos as a human being. You're no longer, fully becoming yourself has no meaning, because you can become anything. You're sort of detached from the cosmos, detached from God. And so this new account of freedom comes around. But on the other hand, as we see, I would argue throughout this book that we're less free, in fact, that the loss of that older, deeper account of freedom in practice has left us less free. And to make it all very concrete, for example, I talk about the loss of the American Sabbath. That was done, it only came about in the last 100 years or so. Before that, America had this very robust Sabbatarian tradition, Protestant tradition.
It's one of my favorite parts of the book, by the way.
Yeah, and we got rid of the Sabbath in the name of greater choice. Now on Sunday you can do whatever you want. You can shop, you can work, whatever. But in practice, it just means that we're more harried, and the liberty for the liberty of the market didn't necessarily mean liberty for the family, didn't necessarily mean liberty for the worker. Um, and yeah, so I mean, I'll stop there, but I do think that ultimately it goes back to the Enlightenment, and it's a rejection of really the concept of a human nature that's discernible by reason, and a human nature that is part of a whole that is also reasonable and orderly, and the sort of divorce between man and the scene of his life.
It's like these ancient heresies keep coming back in new forms, right? I mean, like so much of this seems Gnostic. You know, you have this like the infinite malleability of the physical man. You know, what do you identify as? You know, these are constantly multiplying categories, because you know the expression of freedom is you have to do something new, right? If you were born a man and identified as a woman later, fine, but maybe you want to be something else tomorrow, and so you have this sort of multiplicity of new categories that are all, you know, if you believe in sort of progressive, you know, a progressive view of history, then you could just push out into these new frontiers, but it divorces man and his soul, or man and his spirit, right? So, which and that's not new, right? This we've seen this before. This is, you were saying, kind of alluding to this before, as you know, you when you were younger, you thought that sort of Christianity had been debunked. I always think this when young people especially do this, or you know, Christian skeptics or new Christians, they're reading doctrine or the Bible or whatever, and then they have this they have this question about maybe about a difficult passage or something like this, and they always think that they're the first ones who've discovered this, like, you know, right? Like, why is there evil in the world? Like, I just like I'm 17 and I've just figured, I just found the bug in this. Nobody's ever possibly considered this before. And I'll tell you, as a Christian, this was one of the things that was extremely liberating for me years ago, which is when I found out that actually these things have been hashed and rehashed. Like, whatever you have thought about, whatever you know, it's something that's difficult or challenging, or you know, maybe sometimes it seems like there's a contradiction. People have smart people, serious people, have spent their lives thinking about these things and trying to understand them in a better way. And there is a sense, there are places where you don't, I think, quite get there, and you have to accept that there's mystery. But also, before you get to that point, just accept the fact that there are answers that have been offered already by people who have really thought through these things. But let me just roll back on this idea of the Enlightenment. You know, one of my observations, and I'm going to use Locke here as an example of sort of the high Enlightenment, and obviously particularly important in the American context. But Locke, you know, Locke very self-consciously uses Christian vocabulary in a lot of his writings. Now, he obviously had that in his, everybody did, but had that sort of background. But his was, you know, an anti-Christian project. And I guess here's the question I want to ask is, you know, is the Enlightenment a Christian heresy? Is that a useful way to think through some Enlightenment philosophy?
I would say that in Enlightenment philosophy, you see echoes of two ancient heresies. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Enlightenment is just the Christian heresy. It is a new thing. It is its own thing. So it needn't be definitively ruled that way as a Christian heresy, but you certainly see echoes of it. In the setting man apart from the cosmos, it's very much Gnostic. You already alluded to this. All the Gnostic religions that emerged, you know, in late antiquity, Manichaeism, 200, 300 AD, Marcionism, 100, 200 AD, all of these religions, although they were very diverse, they had this sense that man is at odds with the world, that there is an orderly cosmos, and it's a prison for humankind, that your true self is not bodily, is not embedded in this community, this body, this community that you find yourself in nature, but that these things oppress your true self, which is just your ability to, your mind, your ability to choose, your ability to make kind of willful, autonomous decisions. The ancient Gnostics had that same suspicion. They specifically, they often rejected the Old Law, the New Testament, because they believed that the God of the Old Testament, which was a God of the law and of order, couldn't have been the same God of the New Testament, who's a God of grace and love. And that fundamentally human beings are these sort of divine sparks that happen to be trapped in the body. And there's much of this in Enlightenment philosophy, the idea that, I think, therefore I am. Nature is just this sort of horrible scene of conflict, and I seek to assert my own individuality and autonomy over nature, over other human beings. In this sense, there's echoes of Gnosticism. The other, I think, ancient heresy that gets echoed by the Enlightenment is Pelagianism. Pelagius was he didn't believe in original sin, and therefore believed that human beings could achieve perfection on their own without the need for sort of a grace dispensing body like the church. And there's, in its political dimension, classical liberalism, Enlightenment inflected classical liberalism can have some of that, in the sense that just treating the individual as an atom and not part of any social structure, and rejecting any kind of social structure. I can do this on my own. Certain Christians today kind of echo that worldview as well, where you say, well, society seems to be pretty anti-Christian, and it's not good for people of faith trying to bring up kids. They would say, well, you just gotta have your faith. You gotta, you shouldn't want to order society in such a way that it supports your faith, because you should try to seek perfection on your own, over against this horrible environment that we may have built as a society. So yeah, I think if I were to identify two kind of key heresies that I see resurrected in the modern era, I would say Gnosticism and Pelagianism.
The Pelagianism is a very good point. Now, people don't talk about that enough. I guess I suppose it's a small subset of people who want to hear the Pelagian analysis of modern politics, but it's right, because it's that sort of it's that sort of self-righteous perfectionism that you see. It's pretty, it's just sort of an endemic within liberalism. And you see it in, we've seen a lot of it over the past year or so. But it's always present. If we do X, then we will get Y, and we'll be better off, and we can demonstrate that by some sort of act of public. Not just I was going to say contrition, but it's not that. It's often ritual sacrifice. Right. That's one way that I try to sort of understand cancel culture, which is it's just ritual sacrifice for the remission of sins. The point you make about separating man from the cosmos, this is even present within the Christian sort of what I hear you call the right liberals. I think that's right. Anybody who affirms the Apostles' Creed knows that Christ was resurrected bodily, and we look forward as Christians to the bodily resurrection. We don't shed our bodies. And the point is that our bodies are a part of who we are, and that there is we should. Well, let me divert for a second. I was in a Bible study probably 7 or 8 years ago, and there were 5 people in the Bible study. A couple of I was in the middle. There was a couple of guys who were about 15 years older than I was, and there were a couple of guys who were about 15 years younger, and I was stuck right in the middle of them. And these younger guys were guys who had grown up grown up in the church, had been very active in the church their entire lives, and they were absolutely flummoxed when confronted with the idea that Christians believed in the bodily resurrection. I mean, to the point where, I mean, it was good natured, but they argued with me and said, no, that's not true. Like when you know, that's just not a thing. And I said, like, you're familiar with the Apostles' Creed, right? It's not like this isn't like an innovative idea I just came up with here. And I wound up remonstrating with them for, 20 minutes and then this long email thread over the following week or two. But when there's a very different outlook on a lot of things when you think that the body is merely an impediment to be gotten rid of or to be gotten over, right? But when you realize that these bodies, while imperfect, but they will be perfected at some point in the future, you realize that like this is the created order, right? Again, marred by sin and imperfection, but yet looking forward to. It's like a type and a shadow of what's to come. It gives one a very different view of who we are.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I do have a chapter in the book toward the end is, what do you owe your body? And it's basically a tour through Gnosticism. And it's important to say that my Jewish friends always say this, and I think they're right, that Christianity, unless guided very carefully theologically and philosophically, Christianity can easily slip into Gnosticism, because our Lord so often talks about, my kingdom is not of this world.
Right.
You're not those who can harm the body. And so if not married to the truths of reason, but also truths of revelation, like the fact that you mentioned that, our Lord was resurrected in bodily form. He's fully God and fully man. The Virgin Mary carries him to term in a body. She also, according at least to tradition, was also assumed to heaven as in bodily form. All this suggests that that we have a bodily claim to perfection and not just a merely spiritual one. And always the Gnostic is an invitation to irresponsibility, as I argue in the chapter. Every time you hear people say you're not your body, it's an invitation to say, I can will various things over my body because my body has no norm. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a fleshly apparatus that my mind stuff happens to be tethered to. Or and then widening that, your inherited obligations like family, community, nation means nothing because I'm just spirit stuff. And so with kind of transhumanism, transgenderism, and the kind of cosmopolitanism that denies any kind of particularity to the family, to the nation, all of these have sort of Gnostic impulses. And I would argue there's an invitation to moral irresponsibility there, always lurking. Because if I'm not part of my community, if I'm not part of my body, I can do anything I want in a way. The old ancient Gnostics never had kind of the technological prowess that contemporary heirs possess. So our Gnostics can do kind of really dangerous stuff, I'd argue.
Yeah, the transhumanist thing is I won't, against my better judgment, I won't shame anybody right now, but I was listening to somebody who's very well known, like in the tech world, especially in the sort of the crypto space, who's very active on Twitter. So people probably know who I mean. But somebody who I respect a lot on this stuff and is very, has a lot of ideas, is super generative in that way. But I heard him on I think it was on a Clubhouse talking about, sort of like like this transhumanist utopia that'll be, that's, imminent. It sounded perfectly horrible. Like, I'm like that sounds like he was talking about how there would be maybe these suits and like VR suits, and then somebody could like live in Guatemala and they could, actually saying like these people would have access to the U.S. labor market because they could just wear this VR suit, and it would be. I mean, it was almost like a parody of itself in a way.
But also, it's just
And
like a perfect illustration of what I just said, right?
yes,
Like
exactly.
I don't
Like
have responsibility to the people around me. I could
right.
just
I
have
thought,
virtual labor, you know.
I thought that sounds terrible. I wouldn't want to, I wouldn't want that. Like, look, you never have to go outside anymore. You can just get virtual outside. I'm like, are you trying to sell me on this, or have me become a Luddite and try and destroy all technology? Because that sounds like a truly godforsaken way to live. All right, so let me sort of shift gears on you a little bit, Sohrab. You are very active online, and I appreciate your Twitter feed and that of the ecosystem around you. People like Adrian Vermeule and some of the other people who sort of talk. I guess this is going to be my question. Talk about sort of integralism. Some of it, I think, but correct me if I'm wrong, is tongue in cheek. Maybe not. This is a safe space. You can say what you think. But like what? Like in an American context, I'm going to break some news here, but I don't think that the Catholic integralist monarchy is imminent. I hope not to disappoint any of my listeners. But what, I guess what's that all about?
Yeah.
And that's part A, and part B is like, what is a better version of America that you'd like to see?
Sure. It's a very good question, and I'm also here to echo your breaking hot take that we're not headed for any kind of union of throne and altar.
The Habsburg monarchy will not resume in Washington D.C.
Not least because we don't have a throne to which we might marry our altar, and also because frankly, I think the people that I take most seriously in that space that you mentioned, none of them are kind of throne and altar, costume LARPers. They're serious Catholics, people of faith. And the vision that they hearken to it has a historical dimension, but they're not married to specific historical forms. And I'll explain what that means. The vision that political Catholicism is my preferred term to integralism. Integralism is bound up with certain movements in Europe in the 20th century,
Yep.
which I have no brief for. But political Catholicism is or political Christianity, you might even say, is just the idea. Or let me put it this way. It all depends on how you see the Constantinian conversion. Do you see the Constantinian conversion as a perversion of the faith, as something that the faith was supposed to belong to a small elite, a kind of ascetic elite of the early church, very persecuted, but looking heavenly-ward and therefore able to withstand a great deal of persecution? Or do you see the Constantine conversion as the faith becoming more itself as a religion that is a religion of the masses, of the ordinary person, so that when Christianity becomes first the legal and then eventually the official religion of the Roman Empire, the share of the Christian share of the population suddenly explodes from something like whatever estimates vary, 10-20% at most, to suddenly 90-95% by the time you get into sort of late antiquity. And do you think that's a bad thing or a good thing? I mean, I would argue from the perspective of what's called historic Christianity that was the faith becoming more fully itself. Our Lord wanted to be with the masses. He loved the masses. He loved the wedding at Cana. He loved children, and this all suggests a religion that's not a religion of just ascetic, monastic types and martyrs, but also the ordinary person. And so what the Constantinian conversion did was it made it possible for someone who may not have understood the creeds completely, a Roman person who may not have known exactly what every article of the creed means, and he may have been offering sacrifices to the polytheistic host, 2 weeks earlier. But nevertheless, now he benefits from efficacious sacraments. He lives in a relatively a more humane order where you don't expose babies to die. And church and civilization ultimately encompass each other in a full of tension, obviously, as late antiquity melds into Christendom really is born, and the medieval era full of tension between popes and kings, and how do you define the boundaries between the two and so forth. So it's not like it's all pretty, but nevertheless you have a civilization in which the ultimate end of life, as we said, is if the highest good of a rational being is to know and to love God, who is reason itself and love itself. If that's the end of goal of life, this was a civilization, the foundation of the West, that sought to make that possible for the masses. And the loss of Christendom, I would argue, is a tragedy, because it's made it very difficult, for you to be a Christian. Not only the kind of persecutions that we now face from a secular liberal regime, but also, all the sort of degraded temptations, it's kind of hyper commercialization and so forth. They're all in tension with the life of faith. Now, what would a Constantinian vision look like in the 21st century? It would not necessarily mean Constantine or Theodosius or Charlemagne or whoever, or Louis X. It would be something something different. But can we imagine a situation in which church and civilization once more encompass each other, in which the laws enshrine Christian orthodoxy, but in a sort of reasonable way, with tolerance for others, and because Christianity itself is a reasonable faith, correcting for some of the excesses or mistakes of the Middle Ages. You don't want to romanticize it. It wasn't all great, but terrible persecutions that were a counter witness to Christ. You can recognize that now. But nevertheless, you sense that, okay, one way or another, there's going to be some orthodoxy that's enshrined in the public square. And this is the one that made the West, and made the West's humane civilization. That's what it would mean today. And so what does that mean in a concrete way? For me, as a political actor, it just increasingly just means, a world in which my son isn't likely to encounter pornography before he hits puberty, as he is now, statistically speaking. It means that Christians pay attention to the material substrate that makes a life of virtue possible. Life of virtue isn't just a matter of mind, but also there's kind of a material dimension to whether or not you can live a life of virtue. And so that means, corporate power, when it becomes overweening and makes it impossible or very difficult for people to have children or to devote time to their children and families, needs to be disciplined by the state, so that people can also, other goods can be pursued, including worship and childbearing and family formation and so forth. So it's not a very concrete policy things that an integralist political actor would pursue. And you and I know obviously you're not a Catholic, but I think you and I would find a lot to fight for in the trenches together.
I mean, if I look at American history, my view is that America very much found itself in the broad stream of sort of the traditions, but the sort of the pattern and practice of Christendom from the time, from sort of 1607, the original sort of Jamestown, until it's hard to put an exact date on it, sometime after the Civil War. And then really things started to change. I
mean, as you know, we had magistrates who had the old kind of Blackstone tradition that said Christianity is the law of the land.
Right, that's right.
You had convictions for blasphemy upheld into the 19th century in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of our libertarian friends, I always say, they retcon a libertarian past into the American 17th, 18th, 19th century.
I was about to use the term retcon, because I think that's exactly right. It really is a retconning of the way that America thought about, I guess let me rephrase it. I think it overemphasizes Enlightenment philosophy. That is not what motivated 17th, 18th, early 19th century Americans, by and large. Obviously, there were some, primarily in the elites, but go back to the sort of founding era, up the 10 or so, even 20 years leading up to the revolution, and then the 10 or so years afterwards, maybe 20 even. Read the political sermons, and by the way, there were a lot of political sermons. Like, I mean, that was, the media did not have, what we call the media did not have a big role to play. We had a free press and there were newspapers and whatnot, but it was sort of town meetings, and it was sermons. And if you go back and read those sermons, that gives you quite a different flavor of and sense of what those early Americans were actually thinking about and what they were motivated by. And it wasn't, I think they were on board with the institutions that were described by somebody like a Locke or a Montesquieu, but they thought that they were overlaying those institutional forms on top of a fundamentally Christian society.
I always love this. I for my chapter on the Sabbath, I ended up reading a wonderful book by Gillis Harp on the Protestant tradition and its American Protestant tradition and its link to American conservatism. And it's just amazing detail that in 1798, tensions are running high with France, and John Adams, I believe, calls for a national day of kind of fasting and prayer, and in response to it, all the kind of Ivy presidents come sermonizers, right? They were all kind of men of the cloth, give various speeches, and the president of Yale wants to distinguish the American Revolution from the French Revolution. And he says that the French Revolution is at war with our Sabbath. And if we want our revolutionary regime to not descend into the barbarism of revolutionary France, we have to uphold the Sabbath. This is the president of Yale. So it's obviously so unimaginable today, but what's interesting to me is just the clear evidence that there was a kind of integralism in much of American history. It was a Protestant one, but if I were to, as a Catholic convert, if I were to pick between liberal integralism and Protestant integralism, I always say I would pick the Protestant integralism.
Well, because that's the choice, though, right? You get one or the other, right? There's not a third way.
Yeah.
Well, okay, that is actually, we're sort of out of time, but that's actually a perfect place to leave this. Sohrab, I really appreciate this conversation. Appreciate
Likewise.
you coming on. The book is The Unbroken Thread by Sohrab Ahmari. You can, of course, find it on Amazon, but I will also encourage you, if you have a local bookseller, if those still exist, go buy it there instead. But the important message is just buy it, and buy one for a friend too. All right, Sohrab, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thank you. All good?